While the Pittsburgh Steelers moves in free agency are intriguing, we still got to keep track of what they're doing at pro days. To do that, we'll talk with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com about that and how their draft plans may have changed. Right here in the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it on YouTube. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And as always, we are happy to bring in our man, Alan Saunders. He comes from SteelersNow.com. We've had him on several times now. Lots of things happening. We'll get to Alan's thoughts about some of these free agent moves that they've made over the past week in a bit. But, Alan, you guys wrote about this on your website. It was well reported. Dale Lally talked about this, too. The Steelers were at Iowa's Pro Day on Monday. It was pretty clear, you know, they're there. There's really interesting prospects like Lukas Van Ness, the defensive lineman / edge rusher / wherever you want to line him up on the defensive front. There's Jack Campbell, who's a lot of people may be calling the best linebacker of this group and could be an interesting fit with the linebackers the Steelers have signed. And it goes along with, and the Steelers brass was there. It wasn't just, you know, Pat Meyer being there like he was at Northwestern, but the Steelers brass so far has been at Georgia, Clemson, and Michigan. I know it's still very early in the pro day process, and you know there's weeks for this to play out. But from what you've seen of where they're targeting, has any of what they've done kind of tipped off anything to you about something that should pique Steelers fans' interest about their plans in the draft process?
I think Iowa says something, right? I mean, look, we don't really know what to make of the Omar Khan draft world because this is the first one. So, you know, all we can kind of do is say, hey, Omar learned from Kevin Colbert. They worked together for a long time. He's probably not going to be all that much different, right? Well, the Steelers, for many years under Kevin Colbert, did not draft a player in the first round that they did not scout in person with Colbert or head coach Mike Tomlin being there at either their pro day or some sort of in-person scouting opportunity like that. And so to be at Iowa, I think to me says a lot about Lukas Van Ness. I love the player. I think he's a very interesting fit for the Steelers. Not a player that I think a lot of people are talking about, one that's been a little bit under the radar. And so to me, that puts him firmly on their board for number 17. Jack Campbell is a player that I think fits the Steelers, but is probably more like a second-round pick. Now that, like, coach GM got-to-be-there thing has not necessarily really applied to the second round the way it has applied to that first-round pick. But, man, when that pick is 32, like, I gotta think it's gotta come close, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. We don't know. Nobody really knows, but it sure seems like,
right.
If I was a betting man, and I am, but you can't bet on this, I would bet that Mike Tomlin and Omar Khan will have been to the pro day or had at least some in-person scouting of both of those first two players they took. And the fact that they went to see Van Ness and Campbell puts them in line for those picks. That's certainly possible.
I think it's certainly possible. And those are two guys, like you said, they fit interesting needs for the Steelers. Van Ness, a guy who could play on the edge a little bit, but he also played 3 technique. I think everyone loved the way that he measured. Also, everyone loved the way Jack Campbell tested at the combine. So there's a lot of excitement there. But as we also said, they've been to Michigan, Clemson, Georgia, and those are kind of your staples. Like especially Georgia, you're going to go to Georgia and Clemson every year. They're cranking out players. Michigan, you got Mazai Smith, you got Schoonmaker, you got interesting people there. I'm always intrigued to look at the top brass visits, like you said, and how that's kind of dictated or at least hinted where the Steelers would be looking in the first round over the past several years under Kevin Colbert. Will that do the same with Omar Khan? We don't know, but I do think that there's an interesting investment here that all of these schools have, where the Steelers could take someone in the first round for most of them. I don't think Michigan has that, but Brian Brzee is a guy for Clemson that I think could be looked at in the first round. Of course, Broderick Jones is a guy that if he could slip his way down to 17, maybe he would be a guy. But I also think a guy who could work his way into the conversation of being that 32nd overall pick is Darnell Washington, the tight end from Georgia. The way that he's built, the way that he plays, that could be a very interesting pick. And I think this is again, I think there's
Nolan Smith. Like, there's a bunch of guys.
Nolan Smith, you're right. They have a ton of guys. There's a lot of guys there. But again, I think this is kind of, it's not good that the Steelers have so many needs, but it may work in their favor that it's not going to be easily predictable who they're going for, and teams won't have it just slated. Oh yeah, they're going there. If we want to get that guy, we got to jump ahead of them. It might not be so obvious in this process.
Yeah, I don't really think. I mean, I think they've done a pretty good job of taking care of their pressing needs through free agency, where they, I don't think there's a position that they have to draft in the first round or have to draft in the first 2 rounds. I mean, there's a lot of things they could want. There's certainly no lack of things that they could want, but I don't think there's anything that they absolutely have to have. And so I think that puts them in pretty good shape. And we're going to see where they go. Ohio State's Wednesday, Penn State's Friday. I expect they'll be at both of those. If they aren't, maybe that'll tell us something. I don't think they were at Penn State last year. That's not one they sort of go to all the time. So Joey Porter Jr., of course, becomes part of that conversation. Lots of guys at Ohio State too. So, I mean, we'll keep it going, but I think they're pretty open about this pick. I mean, look, there's no common thread between, there's a linebacker and a defensive lineman at Iowa. And by the way, Lukas Van Ness is one of my favorite players in this draft. I love him. Like, he's like 85% JJ Watt. Like, you can do 100 different things with him. He's not quite that good, but he's just the same sort of extremely versatile, big athlete that does everything really well. Some team is going to be extremely happy with him, whether it's the Steelers or not. But so there's a defensive tackle and a linebacker there. Well, Georgia doesn't have, either of those two outside of Jalen Carter. Probably not going to be there, right? Now, Michigan has a defensive tackle, but not a linebacker. Like, they have a tight end. Georgia has a tight end. You're not – it's not like last year, right, where I was like, okay, where did the GM and the coach go? Oh, here's where all the top quarterbacks are. Bing. Like, that's not it. Like, there's no clear and obvious pattern here. It seems like they're giving themselves options and leaving themselves open to a number of different scenarios playing out in front of them.
It certainly seems that way. I want to talk about with you in a minute here about how those options could play out now, especially now that we've seen at least the first round of free agency kind of go through in the first week with all the moves they've made. We've talked about that on the show. I want to get your thoughts on that process as well and how that's changed everything. We'll do all that in a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, so don't go anywhere. But first, before we do any of that, we'd love to talk to you guys about our great sponsors at FanDuel. And of course, FanDuel is the #1 sportsbook in America that you need to get into right away. FanDuel, of course, the NBA season is there, but so is March Madness. It's the perfect time to download the FanDuel Sportsbook app, America's #1 sportsbook. And if you do right now, if you're a new customer, you can get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets back if you don't win on your first bet. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. And then you can bet on everything from money lines to point scores to how many three-pointers get drains. And FanDuel lets you make player prop bets so that you can have so many different options when you're putting money down and having fun playing the game. Also, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with same-game parlay. So don't miss out on your chance for the no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined today by Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Alan, the Steelers were pretty active in free agency. They weren't just sitting back, letting guys fall. They went and got guys. Of course, they re-signed DeMonte KZ and Larry Ogunjobi. They went and added Patrick Peterson. That was a huge name that we talked about last week, and how, again, if that was 6 years ago, Steelers fans would have had a heart attack. They were able to get Cole Holcomb. They went and added Landon Roberts, but then they had Nate Herbig, and then they get Isaac Seumalo, the starting guard for the Eagles, not a backup guard who went to the Jets, and he projects to be a guy that starts there. And now you're in a situation where you have Seumalo you project him as a starter immediately for what he did in Philly. You have James Daniels, you have Mason Cole at center, you have Kevin Dotson, you have Nate Herbig, you still have Kendrick Green on the roster. How does this interior part of the line shake out for you as you look at how this is playing out right now?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure we have the answer to it right now. I don't think there's an obvious answer to the rationale behind these moves right now. I think there's a number of options, right? I mean, I think for one, personally, like Kevin Dotson can't feel very good about this, right? Like, I mean, I think he's in trouble. He has the least versatility of all of the players that we've mentioned. He basically only plays guard. All the rest of them can move around at least a little bit. And he, I think, was pretty, at least to me, pretty clearly the worst of the Steelers' 3 interior offensive linemen last year.
I wholeheartedly agree.
The one thing you could say is that he was pretty good in pass protection most of the time, but he also had 2 giant glaring gaffes that ended up with Kenny Pickett being concussed. Yep. So there's nothing to really stand on to put your foot in the ground and say, I got to have him. So, yeah, I think he's probably losing his starting job. But that doesn't necessarily mean that he's the only one. Like I thought Mason Cole was pretty good, and I would like to see what he's capable of if he plays healthy. He spent most of the season limping around the locker room in a walking boot. I don't even know how. Like, what are the medical situation that you can play, then have to be in a boot, then take it off and play again, then put it. I mean, the guy was going through some stuff. I don't know exactly what, but it was clear that he wasn't 100%. So, I mean, I'm a little bit intrigued to see what he could do. I thought James Daniels was their most consistent offensive lineman, especially in the second half. But he wasn't anywhere near as good as Seumalo. Like he's just okay. So I don't know. I'm not quite sure what they have in mind for those other 2 moves. Maybe there's a trade coming. Certainly guys like Cole and Daniels have a little bit elevated cap hits compared to where they were last year. So, maybe a trade could free up a little bit more room. They feel like they've got an upgrade. I don't know. I don't really think we have good answers to that log jam right now, other than they have options, and that's always good. But I would be kind of surprised. I would not be surprised if it's just Seumalo, Cole, Daniels. Mm-hmm. But I mean, Herbig's contract is not one that's an albatross if he's a backup. But we'll see. And Kendrick Green, you mentioned him. I got to think that this is the end of the line for him. And J.C. Hassenauer, who hit free agency, they didn't tender him a contract. Have to think that he's not going to be back now also, just because of the sheer number of bodies they have there.
Right. Now, here's my next thing is we're talking about that log jam in the middle. A lot of people are wondering, guys, what about offensive tackle? That's the position that people were most concerned about. And they haven't made a move there in free agency. But, Alan, one, they can always make a move in free agency. There's still plenty of time and guys out there. But does this signify to you that the plan might be to just draft an offensive tackle very high in this draft class? Not that should be a secret, because we've been talking about that potential for a while, but we've also talked about how there's a good chance they'll probably miss out on the top 3 guys that are, probably certifiable 17th overall type pick guys, and that maybe they'd have to wait until the second round. But does this guarantee to you that they're going to probably they're probably going to concentrate their efforts to make sure one of those first 3 picks is an offensive tackle?
I don't really think it changes anything for me about tackle. Like, I think I've thought they would want one. I think they still will want one. I think it changes a couple things for me. One, one of the things I talked about a lot is if you get a tackle that could move Dan Moore to left guard, that could make the team better at 2 positions. Maybe. I think that's off the table now, right? Like, that's not something they're going to consider anymore. They certainly don't need another guard. The other thing I think is, guys like John Michael Schmitz, Osiris Torrance, those top tier interior linemen, like, there's just no room for them now. Like, I think that's the biggest thing that I see out of this is just, okay, like, guard and center kind of have to be off the board almost, especially guard. Maybe you could still take a center, but like Osiris Torrance is a guy that I thought was a legitimate option for them. In a trade back from 17, or if he falls to 32, I think he kind of comes off the board now, just with the accumulation of bodies at guard. Maybe they could find room for a guy like Schmitz or somebody else at center later on. But yeah, I think if they drafted, if they drafted an offensive lineman now, it's overwhelmingly likely to be a tackle. Whereas before, I felt like it was a little bit more open. They could have kind of gone a number of different directions.
What is the logic, you think, behind making so many moves to fortify the interior with veterans and not necessarily doing that for offensive tackle? Is it price range because offensive tackles generally cost a lot more, or is it another reason that we're missing out on here?
It's a combination. It's price range and the fact that they still have the guys that they're trying to replace, right? So when you lose a player, okay, like when the Steelers they lost Cam Sutton, right? He was gone. Okay. Well, it doesn't take much to be an upgrade over gone, right?
Yeah.
Okay, just go get a guy. Doesn't really matter like if he's great or just above average or good or so look, you need one, go get one. When you have the guys you have, okay, when you have Kevin Dotson on the roster, then it takes a really good player to be a clear upgrade on Kevin Dotson. It takes a guy like Isaac Seumalo. Like, that takes someone that good to be a clear upgrade. The difference is, at guard, a clear upgrade costs, what, $7 million a year? At tackle, a clear upgrade costs 24, right? Like, so, I mean, that's, and when you still have all those guys, I think that's kind of how you have to operate, right? Like, the Steelers could upgrade on their tackles in the draft. It was always very unlikely, and I was actually kind of surprised. They had some reported interest in Orlando Brown. I could not see them picking up anything near that price tag for him. I just don't think they have the ability to be flexible enough to make it fit under the cap. Not that they wouldn't be willing to. But so, yeah, I mean, I think it's just not feasible for them to go get. Like, Isaac Seumalo was the number one guard available in free agency. I don't really think it's close. I think he's a top 10 guard in the entire league, and he was healthy all last year after showing some injury issues the two before. Like, a tackle that you could say all those things about would be the most expensive player on the Steelers offense by like 5 times over. Like, so like, it's just not feasible to do that kind of upgrading at tackle through free agency. They almost have to do it in the draft if they're going to do it.
No, I feel you on that. And another thing, before we move past this, because I talked about this last week, but I want to get your quick insight. Is it possible, just kind of likely, that maybe the interested in Orlando Brown thing was not $20 million a year interested, more like, hey, Orlando, what's nope? And he hung up the phone, and that's what the agent ran with?
I mean, maybe. I don't know. I think there's probably some interest in the player. Like, let's clearly.
I mean, like general, like, hey, what's up, man? What would it cost? And when he says, well, the Bengals are offering me $64 million over 4 years, we ain't got that kind of money. We got McDonald's at home.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably some curiosity at what the top of the market is too. Like, they just want to know where the guy like that is going to go. And so, yeah, you reach out, you have interest, and I don't doubt that there was interest. I'm not sure if there was ever a thought that was realistically about to happen. Probably not.
Right. I hear you on that. But back to where we're going here with this, I do think that offensive tackle, and again, it doesn't have to be 17th overall. There's guys that you and I have talked about, like Matthew Bergeron, who could very much fit the bill in the second round. And I think that's certainly could be part of the plans. But like you said, the Steelers have been addressing a lot of positions across the board. They've been doing their due diligence to kind of fill in the holes. They've got a whole new linebacker room. Linebackers very much a potential spot they could still consider as a draft spot there. But the way things have lined up make me really think that offensive tackle is on their minds, especially early. And I'd be very intrigued to see where Andy Weidel lines up a lot of this offensive tackle class on his big board.
Yeah, I definitely think tackles on their mind, and I do think that they're probably not likely to get one of those top 3 guys at 17. They would probably have to trade up to do it, and I don't think any of the other guys are worth that pick. So you're probably looking at either a trade up, a trade down, or 32. And there's good options there. I mean, you named Bergeron. I think he's one. Dawand Jones from Ohio State, Anton Harrison from Oklahoma. Like, there's good players that are going to be available in that area that they could take that maybe are not necessarily like walk-in day one starters, but really good players that can upgrade that line this year. It would be expected to play this year. What may have to battle for a job, may need to build up to it, but I think certainly you're still expecting to get a right-away contributor at that position, even if you take a guy at 32. And so, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good options there. It seems to be the position that I think fits their needs really well that I think just lines up. It's a pretty good draft with tackles. There's a number of them. It's not like defensive line where like, yeah, they need one, but there's only a handful of guys. Like, we've mentioned on this podcast, I think like 3 of the 6 like realistic options for the Steelers to potentially draft a defensive tackle. There are a number of guys on offensive line that I think could make an impact, and so it makes it a little bit easier to kind of feel like they'll be sure to get one.
Absolutely. I want to talk to Alan about some coaching moves the Steelers have also made as far as guys down the assistant line. We'll go over those in just a minute here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, so don't go anywhere as we get ready to break that down. But first, I want to talk to you guys about Built Bar. And as y'all know, I was just in Greensboro, North Carolina, and Dayton, Ohio, covering March Madness, which was a blast. You want to get my coverage, go to post-gazette.com. But Built Bar has its own March Madness, and that's right. They have a Built Bar March Madness bracket where they're matching up flavor to flavor. What's the best Built Bar or Built Puff out there? And the votes are what make it count. Go to check that out. Go to BuiltMarchMadness.com to vote for your favorites. I'm going to be voting for the double chocolate flavor because that's always been my favorite of the Built Bars. But if you have a favorite Built Bar or Built Puff, get your vote in now. And also, when you're voting for your favorite Built Bar or Built Puff, you'll be entered to win a drawing where 50 lucky Locked On listeners will get a free box of Built. Not only that, but one Locked On fan will win a 12-month subscription to Built to have Built's best bars or puffs delivered monthly straight to your door. You got to try Built. Built has the best protein bar ever. Seriously, they're so amazing. You won't think that they're good for you because they're having a 100% real chocolate. They're only 130 calories, but they pack 17 grams of protein. What makes Built Bars and Built Puffs so good is that they have all that wrapped together, and they pack so many different flavors that you can check out at the Built March Madness bracket by going to BuiltMarchMadness.com right now to vote for your favorite Built Bar or Built Puff and pick up a box while you're there. You can vote every day in March, so hop in and support your pick at BuiltMarchMadness.com. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Alan, Steelers did make a move Monday. It wasn't a roster move. It was a coaching staff move, and that was to promote Denzel Martin to outside linebackers coach, and then they hired in place Jason Brooks as a defensive quality coach. Now, for those who don't know, Denzel Martin's been with the Steelers for some years now. He's kind of just been a scouting assistant, and he's done some on-field work. He's been here and there for the defense, but now he's officially their outside linebackers coach. So he'll work with TJ Watt, he'll work with Alex Highsmith and whoever else that they bring in there. Brooks is a guy who's kind of bounced around a little bit. He used to be on the Ravens from 2009 to 2013. He bounced around. He's done some college work. But Alan, what if anything did you read into these moves? Especially Martin as a guy who's been around the organization.
I mean, I don't really think it's going to be that big of a change. Denzel Martin was already sort of the de facto outside linebackers coach. Jerry Olszewski worked with that group last year a lot after they brought in Brian Flores. He had been the inside linebackers coach, and they didn't really have an outside linebackers coach. So, I don't know. I don't think it's really going to make a huge difference as to the way things go for that defense. I expect, Denzel Martin's been doing that job pretty much for a couple of years. Brooks is actually more interesting to me. Steelers haven't had a defensive quality control coach since 2009. It's been a thing out there. It's been talked about that the Steelers have this abnormally small coaching staff. And I think one of the reasons for that is that Mike Tomlin doesn't really love like a lot of different voices, and he wants his guys to be, if you're the coach of a position, why do we need two, right? I think that's kind of been the thing. And the quality control is something different now. Quality control coaches end up with all sorts of jobs because they're kind of the bottom rung of the coaching totem pole, and so they, it's like other duties as assigned when you sign up to be the intern and you end up being the mascot, right? That's kind of what happens when you're the quality control coach. But their number one job is self-scouting, right? Looking at your team like you're an opposing coach and trying to break it down and pick it apart. I think that's something that's very interesting to me that the Steelers have not had a lot of. They hired one on the offensive side, Matt Tom show 2 or 3 years ago. And to me, that's something that a well-rounded coaching staff has a big part of itself. And I think that's something that the Steelers are showing a little bit of awareness and just, hey, like this is something that deserves. And I don't want to say the Steelers weren't doing it just because they didn't have someone whose specific job it was, but I think that's an important enough step that it's good to have somebody in that position. And hey, it doesn't hurt to have somebody doing your self-scouting who's going to approach it from the perspective of the Baltimore Ravens, right? Like he's built for that job to know exactly what they're looking at to take advantage of the Steelers defense.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see what the moves there and to see how those roles could mesh together. And one thing we've talked about a lot on this show over the past, all the time, really, especially when we hit the off season, is the idea of younger coaches being involved with the Steelers and guys working their way up and coaching tree. And Denzel Martin's a guy, he's moving up the list. Now he's a legitimate position coach for the Steelers, and now he's someone to keep your eye on and be like, hey, there's a young guy who's been with the team and who's been growing naturally, and we'll see where he goes from there. Of course, Terrell Austin, is going to be the guy for a bit here, and there's other guys that are definitely higher on the list there. But it'll be interesting to see how he works with this outside linebacker group. Because also, I feel like the outside linebacker is probably the one group that you have to do the least with, other than just keep them consistent right now. Maybe if they draft a younger guy to come behind T.J. Watt and Alex Highsmith. But I feel like my job as the outside linebacker coach would be like, hey, Alex, T.J., do that thing, man. And I feel like it would just be that.
Some credit for Alex Highsmith. I mean, this is a guy came out at the group of 5 level, wasn't, and still isn't really a prime athlete. Now, I always thought that Alex Highsmith was a really well-developed pass rusher before he got to the Steelers, but
true.
I really think we saw some substantial growth from him, especially over this past season, that if you're looking for someone to give some credit to, like, I think Denzel Martin is the guy. Like, I think that's well-deserved, and that obviously Alex is doing the work, but I think, we generally give coaches the credit when you see a guy in their position room take a step forward. And I think we really saw that from Alex Highsmith, turning into not just a pretty good pass rusher, but one of the better overall stand-up outside linebackers in the NFL. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that development. TJ Watt, look, I'm pretty sure I could be TJ's position.
Yeah, that's
coach.
what I'm saying. Like
I would do that job real good. Like, TJ,
get him. Get him, TJ.
Gatorade, towel. What else can I do? That's the extent of my ability to assist you. I can bring you water, Gatorade, a towel. I'll give you listen, I'll rub your shoulder. Like, hey, I'll give you next time, buddy. I don't, what else is there? I don't know what the man does. Not only is he incredibly talented football player, but he's so obsessed with his craft and the technique of his position that I really don't even know how you would approach attempting to coach that guy up about anything. You know what I would do as TJ's coach? Would be like, look, you got to be a little more personable in the interviews. Okay.
Yeah, there you go. Work for us, Alan. We'll get us some media stuff.
Could we see a smile like twice a year? Like, could we get that out of you? Could you just maybe start them off with a joke or so, maybe that's how we could coach up TJ Watt, because it ain't happening on the field.
No, but even Alex Highsmith, I mean, you and I have been there at Steelers practice where when the first team defense comes off, they just go off and they start like karate chopping each other and practicing defensive moves and stuff. That's who they are, man. They both together are workhorses that develop and grow, and that's why that position is really strong. So, and this is not to say that Denzel Martin is just going to be a stand-in figure and he's not going to do anything, but I think he's going to have a really good opportunity to work with these guys and maybe help them develop their chemistry, but also we talked about, I think this is where it'd be very interesting, the depth pieces behind them. Quincy Roche was brought back, and what could they do with Jamar Jones and those guys? Maybe they draft an extra guy at edge that'll be in there. And not only how do those young guys develop, but how do the Steelers use them as a rotation? Because we know Andy Weidel with the Eagles love to keep his rotations, and we know the Steelers want to keep their pass rushers' legs fresh for the important part of the game in the fourth quarter. All of that does play a factor here, and as much as you just, I think the best coaching for TJ Watt is say go and go forth and conquer. But I think that there is definitely something there that could be very interesting to watch to see how that coaching change plays out.
Yeah, definitely. Like I said, I don't think we'll see a huge change. Really either of them pretty minor moves, but I think it's a positive that they're doing a couple things that they've not done, and expanding the realm of their coaching positions and developing a young coach. I mean, they picked Denzel Martin straight out of the University of Missouri. He had 1 season of coaching experience between his playing career and working for the Steelers. So, that's a guy they are developing, and it seems like doing a pretty good job of it.
I hear that. We'll see how that continues out. The Steelers have more pro day visits coming up, and also more free agency moves that I expect coming down the line. Do they lose some people? Do they restructure some people? Is there something else we're missing here? We'll have all those updates for you here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Thanks for checking us out. Alan, thank you for joining us. Let people they can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
SteelersNow.com, _PGH on Twitter. Wherever else you want to find me on social media is cool too. And got some good stuff coming up. Going to the Ohio State Pro Day Wednesday. Going to we'll be at the Penn State Pro Day Friday. So lots of content there coming up this week. See where Mike Tomlin and Omar Khan are visiting and who they really want to see.
I'm Chris Carter, and I ain't going nowhere. I've been everywhere over the last 3 weeks. I am cool, chilling right here in my house, recording these shows for y'all, and then doing my work for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. By the way, check it out at post-gazette.com. But thank you, Alan, for joining us. Thank you all for watching and listening to this show. If you listen to it on your favorite podcasting app, or if you watched it on YouTube, like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of our daily episodes. If you want to help us out even further, go on Apple Podcasts, leave us a 5-star rating with a positive review. If you give us with the positive comment with the 5-star rating, we give you a shout out at the end of the show. Thanks again for everyone who supports us. We'll be back tomorrow with more right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast with your host, Chris Carter.